Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who have joined this call today. Uh, so we have participants today, and also some speakers are in different part of the world. So we have Rob from NRGI, who is in New York, and also some other colleagues in Oslo, and then from Armenia, and also from Timor-Leste. Thank you so much for taking your time to join this
Спасибо,
workshop.
что вы подключились к нам.
So maybe we can
Итак,
just start.
может быть, мы сейчас попытаемся проверить.
So this workshop is focusing on
Этот
how civil society
семинар
is using extractive contracts. The countries that we are selecting, Armenia, Mongolia, and the Philippines and Timor-Leste, are countries that already disclose extractive contracts, and we think that it is useful to gather civil society together in a workshop just to understand if there has been some work around the use of extractive contract data in your work, actually. And before we start, I just want to mention that this workshop is recorded, and also we have interpretation available in Mongolian, in Russian, and also in Teton for colleagues from Timor-Leste. So yeah, Monica, can you move to the next slide? Yeah, so the objective of this workshop is basically to engage civil society members from Armenia, Mongolia, Philippines, and Timor-Leste, and sharing lessons about experience in using data from oil, gas, and mining contracts as part of the civil society effort to improve extractive sector governance in your own countries, basically. So participants, next slide. So participants actually CSOs members who are also part of the MSG groups in EITI implementing countries from Armenia, Mongolia, Philippines, and Timor-Leste, and also National Secretariat members join as well. Next slide. We have shared the agenda with you, so we will start with Gay audience who will be explaining about global best practices and regional updates with regard to the contract transparency. And then the second part of the session, we have Rob Pittman from NRGI. He's going to present about how to use contract data for policy analysis and civil society advocacy. NRGI has been doing many works in this area, using contracts in policy analysis, doing trainings to civil society, as well as using contract data and analysis for their advocacy. And then the next one, we will be listening presenters from Philippines and Mongolia. So we have Vincent Lazatin from Bantai Kita, and also Termonk from Mongolia. They will be sharing about their experience in Philippines and Mongolia on how civil society in their countries are using extractive data in their policy analysis or their advocacy, etc. And then after that, we will have a question and answer session. So you are free basically to ask questions, clarify anything to the speakers. And after that, we will be dividing the groups into 4. We have a breakout session divided by country: Armenia, Timor-Leste, Mongolia, and Philippines. We already shared with you the agenda and also the questions that you need to discuss in the groups. And each group will be assigned one person from International Secretariat to facilitate and support you in the discussion. And then after that, we will have a report back session, especially from Timor-Leste and Armenia, but also opportunity as well for Mongolia and Philippines to provide some updates on their discussion in the group. And then we have recap and closing. So basically, this is the rundown of the event for today's workshop. So we will start with the first session. I would like to invite Gay to start with her presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I will assume that my audio is working well. Otherwise, please flag, especially my colleagues from the Secretariat. So I'm Gay Ordenes. I'm the Asia Director from the EITI Secretariat. I also lead our work on anti-corruption, which some of you might know also includes our work on beneficial ownership and contract transparency. So I would like to apologize that my internet is a bit unstable, so I'm keeping my video off, but hopefully the PowerPoint presentation would be enticing enough to keep you engaged for the rest of my presentation. So as Emmanuel mentioned, our objective for this session is to discuss and learn from each other what are the emerging global best practices and updates on contract disclosure in the region. So currently there are around 14 countries in the Eurasia, Asia region at the EITI Secretariat, but we have selected this group of countries in particular because these are the countries where we have seen actual disclosures already happening. And we thought that the next logical step for countries that have already disclosed contracts is to understand how to make use of those disclosures to improve extractive sector governance. So today we will not be discussing anymore about legal barriers or scoping or of contracts, etc. Although we are fully aware that those are still very much an issue in some of your countries. But since you have already disclosed at least some, if not all, of your extractive contracts, then the focus is really to be more aware of how we can make use of that information from the contracts that have been publicly disclosed to inform public debate and also policy making in the extractive sector. So can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so I thought it might be useful to have just a quick review or recap of what the requirements are on contract disclosure under the 2019 EITI standard. Most of you are probably aware of this, but just to set the scene and so that everyone's on the same page, we want to just have a quick overview or review of the requirements. So all of you might know by now that the requirement to publicly disclose contracts under the EITI standard took effect on the 1st of January 2021. So the standard says that EITI countries are required to publicly disclose all contracts and licenses that are granted, entered into, or modified on or after January 1, 2021. And in addition to that, there's also a requirement for countries to document the government's policy on the disclosure of contracts and licenses, which set out the terms and conditions for the exploration and exploitation of oil, gas, or minerals. Next slide, please. Next slide. So if you look at requirement 2.4 of the EITI standard, there are also some stipulations there that are encouraged. One of which is that, can we go back to the previous slide, please? So one of that is
один из этих аспектов. Инга, вы меня слышите? Скажите, пожалуйста.
Yeah. So countries are also encouraged to publicly disclose all contracts and licenses which set the conditions for the exploitation of oil and gas and minerals before 2021. So I think it's useful to highlight this because most of the countries in this session are disclosing contracts that have been executed or entered into before the 1st of January, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the cutoff period for the requirement of the standard. Now, that's a good practice that we are highly encouraging you to continue doing, even though technically the requirement applies to contracts after 2021. We still think that there's a lot of value in your disclosure of contracts that were executed prior to the 1st of January 2021. So that remains to be a highly encouraged aspect of the standard. In addition, MSGs are also expected to adopt and publish a plan for systematic disclosure of contracts, including timelines and deadlines for disclosure and plans to overcome obstacles to disclosure. So I know that some countries included in this call already have plans for systematic disclosure of contracts in their respective work plans, Mongolia and in the Philippines in particular. So that's also a good practice that is expected from MSGs under the EITI standard. Next slide, please. So just again, an overview of some of the definitions to clarify the scope of the requirement. When we talk about contracts and licenses, we refer to the full text of any contract, concession, production sharing agreements, or any other agreement, whatever it is called in your country, which sets out the conditions for the exploitation of oil, gas, and mining resources. We are also referring to disclosure of the full text of any addendum, schedules, or endorsements, the full text of any amendment to the contracts. So I think this is very important because for most of the countries in this call, you are currently in the process also of determining what are the annexes that you should disclose apart from the main contracts. So I think it's useful to highlight that it's not only the main text or the main contract that is required to be disclosed, but also the annexes that are relevant to the main contract. And that is very much subject to the determination of the MSG, whatever you think would be useful to be considered as an addendum to the contracts. And then if the contracts have been amended, then the entire contract, even though they were executed before the 1st of January 2021, should also be disclosed along with the relevant amendment, of course. And then when it comes to exploration contracts, so the board has interpreted this aspect of the requirement to mean that all exploration contracts, the MSG should undertake a procedure in order to determine what exploration contracts should be published, considering its materiality. And the materiality of expiration contracts could be because of the fiscal terms in the expiration contracts or environmental provisions in the expiration contracts or other stipulations in these contracts that might be of interest to the public, to the civil society in particular, or if there's any debate regarding that particular expiration contract, then it's important for the MSG to consider that and determine what expiration contract should be included in the scope of disclosure. And then lastly, it is also required for all countries to publish a list of all active contracts, including expiration contracts. So this is a separate requirement that apart from disclosing the actual contract itself, countries are required to also disclose a list of all active contracts in the country. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight some good examples from EITI countries. These are countries outside of Asia for now. Later on, we will be discussing current practices from Asian countries. And I want to start with Senegal. Senegal has been assessed as going beyond the requirements of 2.4 in their most recent validation. And the reason for that is that they are comprehensively disclosing all contracts and licenses from 1979 to 2021, which also includes the period that is covered by the EITI standard. And they are using the EITI platform to improve the accessibility of information from these contracts. In addition, the MSG has compiled a comprehensive list of all contracts and licenses, which they're also indicating where these contracts may be publicly accessed. Guyana is also a good example of how civil society is using publicly available PSCs to raise concerns regarding exceptions on capital gains tax. And DRC has also done comprehensive mapping of contracts in order to comply with the requirement of the standard to disclose a list of all active contracts. And then the efforts of the EITI, DRC EITI to implement government policy in disclosing all extractive contracts has led to clarification of fiscal terms in contracts between foreign companies and SOEs. So because of this effort, they are able to better follow up the revenues paid by extractive companies to SOEs and the transfers of revenues from SOEs to the treasury. And then another example that we often cite is also the work being done by civil society in Malawi, who have used disclosed contracts to analyze terms and inconsistencies with the model PSA. So they have done a comparison of whether the model PSAs are being followed in the individual contracts that are being executed by the government. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so we do have examples of existing contract portals in Asia. And in this slide, you can see examples from the Philippines, and I think Armenia was also in that slide, and Mongolia as well. And so we do want to spend the next couple of minutes going through some of the good practices that we have seen in this country. So to talk about this specific country examples, I will hand over to my colleagues who are leading on this country. So on the Philippines, I will call on BJ to explain the best practices being implemented in the Philippines. Over to you, BJ.
Hi, thanks, Gay. My internet is also unstable, so okay. So okay, I'll try to turn on my video, but I will probably turn it off in a few seconds. Okay, so so I'll be speaking on Philippines and Mongolia. For the Philippines, okay, as you would see, the Philippines has just been validated in February of this year, and on a requirement 2.4, they have been assessed as mostly met. The Philippines has a contracts portal. It has an open database of mining, oil, and gas contracts, which if you go to that link that is there in the slide, you will see that you can browse that site by company name. You can also search by contract type or contract number, commodity, signature date, or location. In practice, most of the mining contracts are published, and the 3 oil and gas contracts in production are also published. Okay, so we also have the coal contracts that are also published on the EITA contracts portal, although it has been assessed that the comprehensiveness of contracts publication is an issue. Yes, as we've mentioned, I think from East, there's a quick correction on slide. COC number 5, or the contract of Senegal, is also publicly accessible through the PHEITI contracts. I think that is clear. East, what is commented on in this slide is that there is an issue with respect to the comprehensiveness of the contract that has been published. Okay. Also, in the last validation, it was also mentioned, was noted that there is no comprehensive list of active contracts and licenses, including exploration licenses, indicating which contracts are publicly accessible and which are not. However, the EITI multi-stakeholder group has included plans not to assess the comprehensiveness of contracts disclosure, and you would be able to find that in the earlier work plans. In fact, in the 2022 work plan of the Philippines EITI, they have mentioned as one of the accomplishments that the MSG has already discussed the definition of contract annexes and the materiality of exploration contracts. Also, the Philippines has there appear to be it doesn't appear to have a full text of licenses that are published. It's also not clear whether there are significant variations between those licenses. But these are all good steps. And what we have just mentioned are what they have started, but they have and what is in progress, and what they're planning to do in the next years. Okay, Monica, on the next slide, please. I'll move on to Mongolia. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay, so for Mongolia, the last validation was in 2018 for their second validation, and requirement the assessment for requirement 2.4 is one of satisfactory progress. Mongolia is going through another validation this year under the 2019 standard, and the preliminary assessment is that it is also mostly met, but that is still it's a preliminary report. In Mongolia, some contracts are disclosed, including one mining investment and 141 company agreements with local authorities. One particular comment is that while many contracts are concluded prior to 2021, and these have been disclosed, the latest contract disclosed date to 2019, with several older published contracts that have some missing annexes that contain key terms and conditions. With the current 2020 report, they have in the portal, there's a total of 895 contracts and 162 annotations at the portal, although it would be noted that this includes a range of contractual documents ranging from the Oyitol-Goy investment agreement to local development agreements between extractive companies and local governments and communities. The CSO, particularly OSF, the Open Society Forum, and the Publish What You Pay in Mongolia, drove the process of establishing Mongolia's open contracts portal, and which is now jointly operated by the MMHI and the Mongolia EITI. So this portal, this has been launched as a dedicated portal for extractive contracts in early 2017. As I have already mentioned about the updates on the published contracts. In 2017, there were 150 contracts. In this 2020, there are more contracts, but of course, as I mentioned, it ranges from different types of contracts. Mongolia also has a license registry. It's a computerized mining cadastre system at their Mineral Resources and Petroleum Authority website. It also, the EITA Mongolia also has a web page on licenses. Okay, so I think that's all for progress in terms of requirement 2.4 is insofar as Mongolia is concerned. Over to you. That could be Olesia or Emmanuel. For the next slide, please.
Yeah, it's me. Hello, dear colleagues. My name is Olesia Nehoroshko. I'm country officer for Eurasia, and I'm going to present the experience of Armenia. As a result of efforts made by Armenian EITI MSG and following the amendments of mining code made in 2018, contracts were fully disclosed. All production contracts, including annexes and amendments, are currently published on the website of the Ministry of Energy, Infrastructure and Natural Resources. Moreover, the first Armenian validation results confirmed that EITI Armenia has made satisfactory progress on contract transparency. And Miss Victoria Buzanyan from Armenian Civil Society will share her experience in using data from published contracts later on this seminar. Thank you very much. I'm hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you. So for Timor-Leste, National Petroleum and Mining Authority, ANPM, is basically responsible for public disclosure of petroleum contracts and mining licenses. There is a list of active mineral licenses, including, and I think mostly development minerals, like sand and quarry for the infrastructure development or building bridges and houses, basically. These are published on ANPM website. However, the license documents are not published yet. As far as petroleum is concerned, there is legal arrangement and petroleum sharing contracts within GPDA, Joint Petroleum Development Area. It's called GPDA because it's jointly developed by Timor-Leste government and Australia. But since 2019, as a result of the Timor-Leste and Australia Maritime Boundaries Treaty, at least 4 petroleum sharing contracts formally within GPDA are now under Timor-Leste exclusive area. So these contracts, especially for the petroleum sector, are publicly available. I think Timor-Leste is one of the pioneers in the contract transparency, and these contracts are accessible in these websites, basically, including full text and annexes. It's very detailed, and also I think there are some are including the summary as well. So yeah, I think Timor-Leste will be validated this July, so we will be able to see how Timor-Leste is progressing when it comes to requirement 2.4 on contract transparency. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's all basically for the first session by Gay. Let me invite Rob Pittman from NRGI to present his slides. Rob is going to share about NRGI works, basically an experience in using contracts in policy analysis and also in advocacy. Please, Rob. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Good evening, all. Can everybody hear me? I can't see anybody, so if, okay, perfect. Good morning, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here today. As Emmanuel just said, I'm going to be briefly doing an intervention to talk about how contracts can be used for policy analysis and advocacy. But before I get going, hang on, I just need to get access to my presentation. Yeah. Before I get going, I'd like to do a poll. So I've got here listed a bunch of different types of information, and my question for you all is, which of these pieces of information listed A, B, C, D, E, F, G can be found in contracts and licenses? And what I'd like you to do is enter your answer in the chat, 1 letter, 2 letters, or several letters. When I say go, everybody then presses enter at the same time, and we can then see what sort of, yeah, what people are answering. So can everybody start by entering what's in, their answer in the chat? Okay. And everybody press enter now, please. Okay, so we have a few different answers. I'm actually quite pleased to see that there's a lot of people who have said G. I think that Gay actually puts it quite well. It's G sometimes. The point is that contracts can include all sorts of information, and that's why they're so important for policy analysis and advocacy work. So I'd like to now move on to the main thrust of my presentation. Again, I'm just gonna need to. Okay, so what I'm going to be covering in this very brief intervention is 3 ways that you can use this information in contracts. The first of these is monitoring compliance. And this is essentially asking questions like, is the company following its legal obligations? Is the government adequately enforcing the rules? The second is scrutinizing the distribution of risk and reward. And we're talking here about risk and reward between the government, companies, and also the citizens. So the questions we could be asking is, how is the balance of risk and reward distributed between the state and the private sector and between citizens? And then the final way that we can use contracts is by we can use them to track changes to the legal framework, because contracts are part of the legal framework. So the way that they change over time reflects how the legal framework is changing. This is important for answering questions like, is the government issuing overly generous incentives? Are the company tying their hands? And I'll go into a little bit more detail on those in a moment. So firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit about monitoring compliance. This is essentially the most the most, I guess, the most quoted and the most referred to way of using contracts. And there's quite a sort of standardized methodology that's grown up around this sort of type of contract monitoring. And the process essentially starts with identifying terms within a contract to monitor, collecting data to see how companies or the government are doing at implementing those terms, and then doing some analysis of that data and engaging stakeholders on the finding. A great example here is from the DRC, where we see this is an example done by 2 civil society groups in the DRC, these civil society groups essentially took this contract. They found a clause within the contract about agriculture and social investments. The clause stated that 0.3% of the equivalent of 0.3% of net sales revenues had to be spent on these investments. What they then found is that actually these investments had actually been spent. And here's a picture of a school that had been made under the investments. But what they also found was that the community wasn't fully aware of those investments. And as a result, they then engaged with the community and with the government to sort of make sure that there was more communication around these things. And there's a report here produced by a CSO called POM on exactly this. Now I'm going to move on to the second of these 3 ways that you can use contracts, and this one is about scrutinizing the distribution of risk and reward. Now, the way that the risks and rewards shared by companies, governments, and civil society and citizens, the way that is dictated is through several terms within a contract, and here are just a few I'm going to list. So fiscal terms, stabilization clauses, force majeure and termination provisions, take or pay clauses, and state participation and arbitration provisions. All of these can impact the way that distribution risks and rewards are distributed. I think here it's really important to think about the background context that we see at the moment. This is a transition away from fossil fuels, just you know, I'm sure people are aware that there's now a growing movement of experts around the world who are saying that the need for more fossil fuels, more exploration, more production is debatable, this is translating into the policies of home governments. We see that in the Netherlands, for example, a court ordered Royal Dutch Shell to cut its carbon emissions. That will have impacts on its production. We see that some majors are now quitting some countries, but at the same time, we're also seeing folks also highlight the need for more mineral production. So there's talk of a minerals boom. So while this may mean that fossil fuel is less likely or less likely to produce going forward, maybe minerals there will be heightened production going ahead. And you know, these changes mean that, you know, will play out in contracts. And so just to take an example, we can look at the transition risks on this project cash flow. And you know, these transition risks, if it's a fossil fuel project, would mean maybe potentially in the long run lower prices, even though in the short run prices might be higher. And it might mean that the project will last less time. And all this means that the initial sort of scenario in which we were calculating how much money and benefits went to the government and citizens might be less than we thought before. So it's really important to scrutinize these risks and rewards with a consideration of this context. Another thing to think about is as well when we're scrutinizing risk and reward is you know, how optimistic are we being? You know, in Ghana, there was very overly optimistic expectations about the projects that were started there. And so this shows the actual revenues in the red line between 2010 and 2018, and then the projected revenues by the IMF and the World Bank in 2009. And against those projected revenues, the country actually took on a lot of debt. And so, you know, this clearly had a lot of impact because the debt they took on was actually a lot more than actually came through the actual revenues. So I'm now going to look at the third of these three ways that we can use contracts, and this is tracking changes to the legal framework. And this is really important because folks are changing the legal framework according to these background contexts that I was just flagging. So we see that you know, for example, some states are offering deals to lure more selective investors. So you know, we're also seeing other countries are trying to speed up their production, mindful of potentially the fact that they might have less time to produce fossil fuels. We just published a report recently about cobalt, and in that report, one of the things we highlighted is that we have very little time actually to countries that want to you know, benefit from this cobalt boom have very little time to do so, and so So the need to make policy and get contractual provisions right is there's a very short window to do that. And finally, another briefing that a colleague of mine did last year looked at whether or not countries are making contracts sufficiently flexible at the moment to respond to these climate change risks that I just mentioned, and these transition risks. I encourage you to take a look at that, and I can send these links after this session. The important thing is here is that because EITI provides and requires country to produce the amendments, EITI should be a great way to sort of look at, the EITI processes are sort of a great forum to sort of catalog these amendments and to then see which direction they go. So that's the end of my intervention for now. I can stay for a couple of questions if there are any, but I'm actually I have some kids who've just woken up, and I'm going to need to get to them in a moment. So but I do have a moment for one or two questions.
Thanks, Rob, for your time. And maybe before we move to Philippines and Mongolia, given that Rob has to look after the kids, if there are any questions to him before we let him go, please. Or to Gay as well. I think Gay is still here.
Emmanuel, I actually have a question for Rob.
Yeah,
if
please.
that's
Gay.
okay. Yes. Thanks so much for the presentation, Rob. Just noting that some countries in the region are obviously also starting to implement net zero targets, and I think it would be of interest to them to understand what are the stipulations in contracts that would likely be amended or revised in order to comply with their targets as they move towards, to align contractual stipulations with energy transition policies. What are the typical contractual stipulations that would be amended or revised? Thanks.
That's a great question, Gay. I mean, I think there's all sorts of things that could be amended and revised. I think one of the main things is going to be stabilization clauses, because they they basically stop the contractual terms from being changed, and so that's a really important thing, to allow, for example, changes in for example, in emission standards, etc. I think countries will also want to look at arbitration clauses. They also might want to look at force majeure clauses too, with environmental changes, how these impact projects. I would suggest if people are interested in finding out a bit more about this, that they look at my colleague Nicola Woodruff's briefing called Tying Your Hands. I'm just going to put it into the chat now. Okay, we've got one more question from Bor Lazol, and then I'm going to have to go, I'm afraid. But Bor, please.
Please, Bor. Go ahead to ask the question. We have Bor Lazol. Please go ahead. Hi, Bor. Can you hear us? You have your hand raised. please go ahead to ask the question. Otherwise, we will go to the next presentation from the Philippines and Mongolia. Any other question to Rob before we let him go? Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. It was a great pleasure to be here. I'll look forward to continuing these discussions as we go forward. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Rob, for your time as well. So let me invite Vincent from Bantai Kita. Please come to present your slides. Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I won't turn on my camera because I've been having internet problems. So if I could ask to share my screen. Yep. Okay, so I'd like to share with you briefly some of the work we're doing in the Philippines with regards to not only contract transparency, but just general data transparency in the extractives. And just to go over this quickly, just to remind ourselves the importance of contract transparency. First, it builds trust and removes suspicion. And this is among the different stakeholders. So it could be building trust between an extractive company and the community in which it operates. It could be building trust between members of a community. And it could also mean building trust between the general population and the government. So there's a lot of benefit in transparency, contract transparency. Second, it helps stakeholders make informed decisions. We know that when stakeholders are involved in decision making, they can only do that in a meaningful way if they have all the information at their disposal. So it's very important for that. Third, it minimizes the opportunities for corruption. Many good governance advocates know that when there is transparency, there are very few places to hide, to make secret backroom deals. And therefore, when contracts are made freely available, it leaves very little room for corruption. And fourth, it does contribute to a level playing field and boosts the business and investor confidence. So these are some of the things that we all kind of agree on when it comes to transparency in general and contract transparency in particular. Just take you through a quick tour of the contracts portal of PHEITI. And this is just a video recording. So we have the homepage for the contracts portal. And that's what the homepage or the landing page looks like. If we go to explore, we will go to the actual contracts, and according to the number there are 226 contracts that are available. If we just quickly go to view all contracts and just click on the first contract, we see there that if we go to view document, you can actually view the document under question. So it's just a sample of what one of those scanned documents looks like. And of course, we have the option to download it in case we want to download it onto a computer and do further analysis. And then I just want to do quickly one of the new contracts. I just scroll down and just randomly chose one. And again, the same thing. If you go to view document, you can see the scanned document in question. So there you go. So quite useful, and everything is there. So what's the challenge to the natural resource governance advocates when it comes to data in general and contract transparency in specific? One of the biggest challenges is really how can communities take advantage of all the data in the extractive sector, including contract data, because as we push for more and more data, it's easy to be overwhelmed in the data flood, and many times our partners don't know where to begin. So what we've tried to do is to try to work with certain communities on trying to address this problem. And of course, NGOs and civil society organizations go to what they know best, and that is training and capacity building. And Bantay Kita has done quite a number of training and capacity buildings in its communities, working with them and showing them how they can use a lot of this data that is available to their advantage. And so I'll start with one example. Our first example is in the province of Palawan, which is on the western side of the Philippines. There was an initial reluctance by the local NGO to engage with BK on natural resource governance, since this particular NGO was actually not in favor of mining. They were actually advocating against mining in their community. But we felt that there was still value to this community, even if they were against mining. And so they finally acceded to our request to present them some of the data that is available online, and to try to show them the log data disclosures, even if they are against mining. In the end, the communities were actually able to use extractive data, including mining contracts, to assess policies that could affect them. And so they were able to use the data that they accessed. The community used data disclosure to better understand royalty payments and advocate for tax exemption. When one of the communities started to compare how much companies should be paying versus what they were receiving, they realized that there was a discrepancy. And when they investigated further, they realized that the discrepancy was the 20% withholding tax. And so upon learning this, they decided that they would advocate for a tax exemption for royalty payments. So again, sometimes you have unintended consequences in data disclosures. Also, as a result of some of the work we did and tried to reach out to these communities. Sorry, my screen seems to be frozen. Oh, there we go. We actually did a infographic, a comic book infographics, to help them understand how accessing data could benefit them. And so we had this very short 6-page comics, infographics, explain to them how they could use Extractive's data. The second example is in the province in northern Philippines of Benguet. In this particular case, the Indigenous Peoples Organization had not received royalties from the mining company that was operating in their area since 2011. Their account was held in escrow due to the cancellation of their NCIP, the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples Registration. The data on IP royalties for 2012-2016 provided them guidance in crafting their community royalty development plan. This information prompted the community to validate the figures against their bank records to see if there's any discrepancy. Using PHEITI data disclosures, the Indigenous Peoples Organizations discovered that the Social Development Management Program was being charged against the allocation for royalties. And this should not be the case. So using the contract information, the community was also made aware of the expiration of contracts. And this is a problem many times at the local level. Many communities are not told when contracts are due to expire. So many times they're sort of groping in the dark. And with access to the contract information, they're able then to know when these contracts are due to expire. And in Benguet, we did something similar. We came up with easy to read and easy to understand graphics that was based on some of the data that communities could download from the Philippine EITI portal. And so here we sort of showed them how they could take a look at this, and it could make more sense to them. So just some closing thoughts. There needs to be a lot of capacity building at the community level, so that they understand, one, that the information is available, two, how to sift through all that information and data to get to the data and information that's valuable to them, and then three, once they have that data, of course, how to use that data. What does it mean to them, and how can they use it to advocate for whatever reforms they feel are necessary? So a lot of training and capacity building is still required. Second is, aside from communities, we should encourage the use of contracts data by media and academic institutions. Again, these institutions can use the data to do wider analysis of the mining sector, the extractive sector. And that can contribute to the discussion as well. And the third thing is, as much as we see the benefits of online data, we may become overly reliant on online platforms because that makes access an issue in communities where internet penetration is low. And in many of the mining communities in the Philippines, and I'm sure around the world, internet access is not so good. So while people like ourselves who live in urban areas with strong internet connections can benefit from online platforms, many of the communities that are directly affected do not have access to the internet. So I caution as we rush forward to put the contract data out in the public realm, not to overly rely on online platforms. So that's basically it. That's basically my 15 minutes in terms of what we're doing in the Philippines.
Thanks, Vincent, for sharing the experience in the Philippines. We will open for question and answer later after we have presentation from Mongolia. So I'd like to invite Turmunk. Sorry if I incorrectly spelling your name. Please come in.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Greetings to all the participants. My name is Turmuk. I am representing one of the NGOs that are working in the mineral exploration field. And my NGO works specifically at the Hovd province. And as for the presentation that I'm prepared to present is in regards to the contract transparency and some of the practices that we use for the contract transparency. Generally speaking, we consider that the contract transparency are robust, a lot more robust than before. However, there are some areas that are not transparent, and especially related to the petroleum mining sites, the provisions and some of the items of the contracts are not transparent. However, Mongolia, use the guidelines for
the government of Mongolia
we
actually endorsed
have
the template and for the community
the
development
partnership
contract. So
agreement
basically,
that
according to
we
the
use.
law on the minerals, the companies, extractive companies and local government should sign a contract. And so according to the law, all those contracts must be published, and within 3 working days, and it must be submitted to the EITI Subnational Council within 5 days, as well as the contract, the compliance with the contract and its updates must be shared with the community every month. That's the requirement and standard clause in the contract template provided by the government. So these are the legal regulation over the contracts between the extractive companies and the government. But now, how they are compliant with, that's a question. So what we found is that the companies or the local governments don't always publish their contracts within those 3 days. And sometimes we see some mining companies don't always publish their contracts, community development contracts, and they basically tend to keep it secret for a while. So in terms of oil companies, the biggest challenge is that most of the oil companies don't disclose their contracts with the government and local community. So actually, EITI Mongolia website, the Mongolia website has a menu on the contract disclosure, and also we have a dedicated website, the contract.mn, and also there are other like these companies and local governments have their websites. When we checked all those different websites, and we basically found that about 50% of all contracts made in Mongolia have been disclosed. So in terms of how we can access to the existing contracts, especially those local development contracts, basically one way is the Untitled.mn. It's actually a part of the EITI the platform. So this is the main source where we can access to the contracts. Also, like the websites of local governments and also the company websites also contain those contracts published. So when we look at those the websites, and when we find that some companies or some local governments don't publish their contracts, and the civil society organizations, we basically could directly address to the contract parties that we can get a copy. So these are some available regulatory framework in Mongolia. So I just previously mentioned about iltotgre.mn. It's a website, the open contracting website. So the Publish What You Pay coalition actually initiated and launched this website for the purpose of publishing all the contracts, the extractive sector contracts made in Mongolia. So in this website, and we basically post as many as possible contracts. So what type of contracts are there? That's a question. And so basically most of the contracts are what we call community development contract, which were signed by the local government and the company. So this, according to the Mongolia's mineral law, mining companies operating throughout the country, they must build a community development contract and publish it on the public domain. And in addition, there are other types of contracts, such as artisanal mining contract, the investment contract agreement, stability agreement, and production sharing agreement. So these are types of contracts that can be accessed from the iltotgre.mn web the platform. So, and as of total of 895 contracts have been posted on this web platform so far. And how we use those open contracts and for monitoring or for compliance checking, for scrutinization. And that's what I'm going to talk to you based on the experience of my organization. So as I mentioned earlier, I run a small NGO in rural Mongolia. So we do some monitoring and we have gained some experience in monitoring the contracts. So our organization and we started working on the open contract in 2016 and 2017, and so there is actually a company called Mono & Co. It's a foreign invested company operating in the rural area, and we just monitored the community development contract between the company and the local government. So based on the findings of monitoring, we also provided some recommendations. So when we did the monitoring, the contract monitoring, and so the challenge was that the contract was not disclosed on the government website. So therefore, we applied the clause and provisions of the Mongolian law on the information freedom and access to information. And so basically, according to this law, and everyone could request the government agency for any information, including the contract. So we exactly did this. And so we had the contract on our hands. So we selected certain clause of the contract, the community development contract. And so we just checked those some clause, and we just also monitored the compliance, and we also evaluated the overall impact from those contracts. And we developed recommendations addressing to the contract parties. So as a result of our monitoring and those parties, and we approached those parties, and we also, our civil society people also worked in the working group for the amendment for renewing the contract when it expired. So based on the recommendations and using our recommendations, and we just we proposed some clauses to the contract, and those recommended clauses were included in the contract. So that's one project we did. And then in 2020 and 2021, we made another follow-up monitoring on the same contract between the mining company and the local government. So we just based on the monitoring, we organized a public hearing public hearing on this contract, and we just brought the community members and many other stakeholders, and our NGO representatives also worked in the working group for developing the new agreement or after the expiration. And then we basically, based on the findings of monitoring, we were able to propose 19 provisions or clauses. Of those 19, 17 were agreed by the parties. So another point is that where we get information from those information, or where we get these contracts, is that basically there are a few ways in Mongolia. So we check the websites, and the second way is we also directly address or just submit an official request to the government and mining companies and asking them provide the copies of their contract. And these are the ways we get access to the contract. And in terms of the monitoring, and we just use first. There's actually what we call the conceptual framework, and that's actually a local level document providing the scope for the community development contracts, and that's the key guide. What was the key guiding document? And we also just received the copies of contracts, then use those contracts for monitoring. We also, not all the contracts, we also ask the contracting parties to provide us the their documents or the final evaluation or kind of evaluation of the contract, performance of the contract. We also ask the local inspection agencies, inspection departments, and receiving their reports. Then we check those reports against the contract clause. So that's some examples of our NGO did. And aside from this, the members of the Publish What You Pay coalition also organize, undertake various activities in terms of contract transparency. So one example is that the Publish What You Pay coalition members and 7 member organizations, they organize the monitoring on number of contracts, community development contracts, in 2016. Then in 2019, 4 member organizations also monitored some artisanal mining contracts and community development contracts. A total of 4 contracts were monitored. And also the members of Publish What You Pay coalition also work on the litigation for public interest. So one example is that there is a civil society organization called the Protecting the Boer Lake and Halch River Natural Park. So we basically use the Mongolia's law on petroleum, and we just submitted litigation to the local court and against the company and the government. So the court basically ruled that those oil companies and must sign the community development agreement with the respective local governor, and so that agreement must include the provisions on the environmental protection. So this is one way that we successfully litigated, successfully just did with the successful advocacy by submitting the litigation for public interest. So finally, we had the judicial decision made in 2019. So the local administrative court basically upheld the demands and now we are working to enforce the law. So another example is that there's an Steps Without Borders NGO, also a member of the Publish What You Pay coalition. The Steps Without Boundaries NGO also successfully sued mining company to the administrative court of administrative case, and asking the court and to order the local government and company to organize public hearings, the community hearings, and when they built the community development agreement. So we basically found that many companies and local governments signed the agreement without any consultation with the stakeholders. So therefore, we just asked the court to rule that those the public hearing or the stakeholder consultation is a must prior to the community development agreement. So we were able, we also succeeded, and the court made that decision that the local government company must organize consultation before signing the community development agreement. So now I'd like to talk about the Publish What You Pay coalition and what we do now, what we are planning to do now. And so right now we are working towards ensuring that the existing laws provide the mandatory obligation to disclose all the contracts. And now all the stakeholders are working on the draft law on the extractive sector transparency, and that law will be submitted to the parliament for discussion. So another area the Publish What You Pay members are working it's that there is actually an investment agreement signed by the Rio Tinto and government of Mongolia. So we just did some thorough, in-depth analysis on the investment agreement, and we also provided some recommendations to the decision makers, and also published what you pay. Coalition is working on analyzing or analyzing the monitoring on the companies' donations and aids provided to the local government and how to disclose them. And so in terms of publish what you pay coalition, and so there's a need to build the capacity of member organizations to monitor and to analyze the extractive sector contracts, and we are effectively seeking for support this. And in addition, we're also planning to organize series of advocacy activities for improving the mining laws, and so therefore we also need some support in terms of capacity and more information. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to answer if you have any questions. And also some member organizations of Publish What You Pay Commission are present at this workshop, so they will also be able to give you answers and updates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dermot, for sharing experience from Mongolia. I think these are important works by civil society in terms of contract monitoring, especially in artisanal mining and also community development agreements, which are pretty much very close to the communities at the local level. So before we move to the breakout session, and we already allocate time for 4 countries, if you have any question to Vincent or Turmon, please go ahead. I saw Estebanus' hands raised. Please, Estebanus, introduce yourself and ask the question to who, please.
Hi, good morning, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah. I have question to the Vincent. So in Timor-Leste, we have tried working with community, how to engage them in terms of the data analysis, trying to provide information regarding to the extractive industry in Timor-Leste side. So I would like to asking the experience from the Philippines, how they collect the, the local CSO there, what what the strategy or what are the way the community used to voicing up their voice regarding to influencing the government policy that impacted to their life. Thank you.
Thank you, Estebanus. Is there any other question from other participants before we give the time to Vincent to address that question? If not, let me call Vincent, please, to come in. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. Could you repeat the question? It was, my connection was a little spotty towards the end of the question.
Yeah, I think the question was, what, based on your experience in the Philippines, how you support the communities to raise the concern relevant to the contract disclosure that you are doing in the Philippines.
Well, what we try to do is we try to facilitate dialogues among the concerned stakeholders. So in communities where issues are raised or issues are identified, then we try to work to connect the community with the relevant counterparty, whether it's government or a particular company. And that's at the local level. And then there's sometimes more recently when action at the local level is slow or nothing happens at the local level, then what we've tried to do more recently is try to raise some of these issues through the EITI, through Philippine EITI, to try to gain the attention of some of the national level counterparts. So we try to resolve it at the local level. We try to create space. We try to connect the different stakeholders together so that they can speak to one another. And if that doesn't work or nothing is resolved, then we try to elevate it to EITI as the venue to try to resolve some of these problems.
Thanks for that. I think we have Erdenes, from Mongolia. Please come in.
Hi, everybody. I'm from Mongolia Coalition. I have a question to Vincent. So I heard in his presentation that something about indigenous royalty. It's very interesting. So my question is that, is there any that type of tax or royalty specifically for the benefit of the indigenous community in the Philippines?
Thanks for that. Vincent, do you get the question?
If you could just repeat the question. I'm not too sure I got it.
Okay. I heard in your presentation that, if I'm not wrong, something about indigenous royalty. So it's very interesting for me that is there any that type of tax or royalty for the benefit of the indigenous community in the Philippines?
Is there any data on royalties for
Did you say
peoples?
in your presentation that like indigenous royalty or something like that?
Yes.
So could you please a bit, explain on that?
So it's required that extractive companies that are operating in areas where there are indigenous peoples and there are claims on ancestral domains, that the companies must pay a royalty to indigenous communities, and this royalty must not be lower than 1% of the production value. So companies must pay royalties, yes. If that answers your question.
Thanks for that, Vincent.
Hi, Vincent. May I confirm with the royalty that you mean? So the royalty is part of the CSR. I mean the corporate social responsibility by the company.
No, it's not considered CSR. It's an obligation. It's an obligation of the company to pay. So it is not considered CSR. It's an obligation.
It is mentioned in the contract between the government and the company.
Actually, there is a law that requires it. So even if it's not explicitly stated in the contract, it must be paid.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm afraid we are running out of time. If you want to have a follow-up question with Vincent, I think you can have bilateral discussion later on with Vincent.
I apologize. I do have a comment to make.
Okay, please, Bor. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can I make a comment?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Hello. Hello. I work in Sukhpatar province, and we have Chinese, Hong Kong, and Australian and foreign investors that are working at the petroleum field. And so these companies are not even working on having contract with the local authority. They don't even, they don't even work with the NGOs. However, in the law, there's no adjudication on the local participation at all. The contract only states that they are working with the implementary companies, that's all. So how do you engage them? Because, for example, the Chinese company called PetroChina, they've been operating since 1993 and they don't pay a lot of taxes. There are a lot of issues with the environmental impact. But the public send their opinions and comments, but it's not really effective. Right now, that Chinese company is located at the Matet Sum, but the 3,000 citizens of that Sum locals are not employed. They have a lot of difficult situations. Again, this is my question to EITI, and how do we get involved? Thank you.
Thanks, Board Losol. This is a question to EITI. If there is any of my colleagues want to respond to that, PJ, I think this is pertaining to Mongolia. Do you want to come in? It's a question about PetroChina in Mongolia, I think. I'm not sure if BJ is online.
It's not only for the PetroChina, but like I said, there's some companies that they only have contract with the government, and then they are not engaged in the of local community at all. And then when we convey our questions to the Ministry of the Mining, they would just limit, say they have their contract with the government and that's all, but no local participation or engagement. And they've been operating in past 20 or 30 years, and they mining operation have not been beneficial at all, or there are a lot of negative impacts to environment. And the local public are not keen on these companies at all because of this lack of transparency and lack of communication. But a lot of these projects are like smaller, but our NGOs are trying hard to engage them, but we are not being effective at all.
Thanks for that. This is, if I can respond shortly, this is not something unique to Mongolia, and many countries in the region, and I think in many other countries also have a similar experience when contracts are signed between government and companies, and there's no effective engagement or consultation with communities where the mining is located. But I think the Philippines can offer a very interesting question because they have free prior informed consent mechanism. BJ, do you want to come in on that front, or Vincent, do you want to share experience about FP process in the Philippines shortly before we move to the next session, please?
Yeah, so the FPIC process in the Philippines is required by law. Before an extractive company can operate in a particular area, they must get the free, prior, and informed consent of the communities in which they will operate. And as nice as that sounds on paper, there are many difficulties in ensuring that communities are indeed fully informed. Many times we've seen that companies will just go through the motions and not really work with communities and really make sure that they are fully informed before they make decisions. So it's nice to have it, and I won't complain about that. It's nice to have that in law, but in practice, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that communities are in fact giving their free, prior, and informed consent. So for countries that do not have it, I would strongly suggest that perhaps you advocate for legislation that would require it, because it's a very important step in the process.
Thanks, Vincent, for sharing that. And for Mongolia, if you want to learn more about FPIC process in Philippines, I think you can have a bilateral discussion with Pantai Kita or other civil society colleagues in the Philippines. I'm afraid you're running out of time. So maybe let's move to the next section. It's a breakout session. You will be divided into 4 groups by your countries, and each country group will be facilitated by one of the International Secretariat staff member. And it will be 10 to 15 minutes discussion, and after that we will come back to the plenary for report back. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back to the plenary. We still have 15 minutes left before the end of the workshop. So I'd like to invite Armenia to start sharing about the group discussion, maybe like 5 minutes. And after that, follow with Timor-Leste. And then if there is any follow-up questions before we close this workshop. Please, from Armenia, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I am Victoria Burnazyan. I will represent the results of our discussion about the first question. What else can you do if your country has already taken steps in disclosing extractive contracts, licenses, and agreements through publicly accessible mechanisms? Our answer is here. We have studied the extractive contracts of the metallic mining companies. We have prepared information leaflets concerning the metallic mining companies' activities in the frame of EITI, socio-economic, environmental, and mining closure obligations which the companies have taken by the extractive contracts. We have distributed information leaflets in the affected communities. We have provided them to the local self-governments, residents, and NGOs, and have collected suggestions from them. The main suggestions of our affected communities are: affected communities should participate in the process of concluding extractive contracts. Certain criteria to be developed on the basis of which the socio-economic assistance of the extractive contract should be determined, and the real needs of the community will be taken into account. The other point is all contracts must have applications for socio-economic support and mine closure. Affected communities should be aware of this process and their opinions should be taken into account. In order to promote these suggestions, it's necessary to work hard to have a constructive dialogue with the responsible state bodies and business, and to manage to reach the decisions based on these proposals. The next question was, what have you heard from your peers that you consider to be useful in your country? Thank you for this interesting workshop. We heard a lot of useful things, and for us it's interesting trainings for the communities. The next, it's important that the contract to be easy to use, to compare the contracts with the other contracts in the country, or to analyze. The contracts should also link with the other data about mining projects or mining permits. These are our answers to this question. The other question was, what are your plans or next ambitions in maximizing your use of contracts data and in performing further analysis of disclosed contracts? The answer is, we have studied very well the contracts of metallic mines, but about 360 non-metallic mines contracts need to be studied, which are also published. More than half of the contracts don't have socioeconomic assistance appendixes, which is also a requirement of the law. It's necessary to work so that all contracts to have those appendixes and to have public control over their fulfillment. And the last question was, what support do you need in advancing contract transparency in your country? The answer is, we need technical and financial support, exchange of the best practices to be able to realize programs for increasing the transparency and accountability of the mining industry. Thank you. If you have questions, we will be glad to answer them.
Thanks, Victoria. Estebanus, do you want to come in to share about Timor-Leste before we discuss? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Manuel. So I would like to share our own experience regarding on the data contract that we have. So in Timor-Leste, we have the data contract transparency that publicly accessible to the people in the AMPM website, we call LAFAC database. So basically, all the requirement, all the template have been put on the platform. But unfortunately, in Timor-Leste, most people, they have no access to the internet, and it's quite difficult to get the information through the platform that we have. And also regarding to the next question, most people in the grassroots level or even in the middle level, like civil society side, we don't have purely experiences on the extractive and mining area, because we are not directly involved in this process. But as we know that the progress of the transparency in regarding to the oil revenue, it's good in the process of the EITI, because the civil society are also in the sitting in the MST group. For then planning in our side, I will giving the chance to my colleague. Martha will be explain on that. So Martha, can you hear me to explain on our planning for the next?
Okay, thank you, Vanus. Just to add, like what Vanus said, I think for better for here we have the good plan to capacity our local NGO or civil society, even national and local municipality. So like we saw, like even we have a report in the website, but not all NGO or participant or community to access. But what you have to plan is how to, maybe we can have summarize, or we have a summarize for some presentation for the report or anything issue regarding extractive happening in Timor-Leste to how to help advocacy in the our rural area. Like example, now in Timor-Leste, like even in the last we didn't participate direct, but now we have some exploration in Swai, like did by some company like Timor Resource. We need to have a good monitoring also, maybe to engage our community to know how the contract between the company and the community, like the owner of the land, some issue or some ambiental issue. We need also to capacitate them, so it will be good to have the advocacy to what happened in the day location. I think it's better to help our advocacy for in Timor-Leste regarding the extractive industry here. I think so.
Thanks, Estefanus and Martha, for sharing Timor-Leste experiences and planning ahead. We have here our National Secretariat team members from each countries, and also from the International Secretariat, who will be able to follow up with you on bilateral basis. So if there are any plans, then we'll be able to discuss further with you. We have 5 minutes left. If there are any comments or questions, please feel free to do that.
Emmanuel.
Yeah,
me.
BJ, please. Yeah.
I think we can, if there are no questions for the two presenters from Armenia and also from Timor-Leste, maybe we can spend the next 5 minutes just to hear any additional inputs from the discussions from the Philippines and Mongolia, maybe Mongolia and then Philippines. maybe just 2 minutes each, if it's okay with the groups. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I think, and maybe useful to focus on the next step for for Mongolia and Philippines, if that is okay. Yeah.
Hello. I guess the Philippines can deliver our initial findings.
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. As for the case of the Philippines, we have dealt with three concerns mainly, which are what is needed to be improved, how these improvements will be realized in the future, and what is the significance of the contract insofar as the community is concerned. Some of the points that we have noted are first, the need for for a summary table of information. Second, the need to enhance the disclosure so in a way that we bring it down to the communities. Third is the possibility of translating the documents other than Filipino and English, knowing that the Philippines has a lot of regional languages across the archipelago. The fourth is the possibility of producing readable contracts, specifically machine-copied contracts. So some of the support that are needed are first, financial and technical support in translating information and contracts in local languages other than Filipino, as well as the support in building capacity of stakeholders to read contracts and use of data found in the documents. And finally, the reorganization of the PHEITI contract website.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Ivan. These are very concrete steps for the Philippines. How about Mongolia? Would you like to share some of the discussion points, please?
So actually, okay, so we had a quick discussion and according to those 4 questions. So let me just introduce the findings just one by one. So in terms of next step, and regarding the contract transparency, so the contracts are now transparent, but now we basically need to work. There's a template agreement which is approved by the government. We need to revisit the template endorsed by the government. So the template would actually should include all aspects and all various provisions and clauses. So in terms of some new ideas from other fair countries, I think the good thing is that there are many stakeholders in the contracts, many parties to the contracts and community members. So I think we basically need the best thing from other countries is that they basically ensure the equal access to the contracts. So in Mongolia, we have many stakeholders to the extractive sector contracts. And so just ensuring more and more accessibility to the contracts. That's one good idea we just got from the other stakeholders, other countries. So the next one on the, so we basically, our ambition is that for the third question, and our ambition was that as we discussed, so the local community and the local government and also civil society organizations, so building or capacity building and training are very important. So because there are so many contracts are on the public domain, and we basically need to ensure that everyone has access to it, that everyone use the contracts. And the question 4 regarding support, we need, and I also mentioned that in my previous previous presentation, and so the technical support for building capacity on the contract analysis, and also training for different stakeholders. So technical support is very important, capacity building support, and financial and technical support. Basically, all the key areas, capacity building and the type of support is technical and financial. So these are what we discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Termong. These are very rich discussions. I only have a couple of notes based on the discussions we have. Now that contracts are published, I think the next steps that is raised during the discussions, firstly, is about accessibility. Now it's published online, but how to bring this data and contracts to the local communities, that is another step for the both for the government as well as for civil society organizations. And the second one is how these contracts are better understood by civil society organizations as well as communities. So this can only be done through trainings or capacity buildings. So I think there is a clear steps forward, and maybe something that can be discussed bilaterally within your countries with the national secretariats or other civil society organizations to continue to work on how to use contract data that is now already published to make sure that these data are useful to support the community, civil society, and to make sure that mining sector is really benefited the citizens, but most importantly, the communities where mining companies are operating. So with that, we would like to thank you for your participation in these workshops. If you have any feedback, just let us know, or if you want to organize another round of session focusing on contract transparency, specifically with the civil society, just let us know as well. So many thanks, and have a good morning, good evening for wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.